I hate him. Those are the words George Brett would say about Graig Nettles, and he would certainly not be alone in harboring that profound sentiment. This is not one isolated grudge between two rivals that faded with the passage of time. This is a pattern that persists throughout an entire career, a deliberate philosophy of competition that defined how Nettles approached the game at every single level he played. This is the detailed story of how one third baseman earned the lasting and significant resentment of some of baseball's greatest legends through calculated aggression, psychological warfare, and a fundamental willingness to cross lines that other competitors refused to cross, even when emotions and stakes were highest. From the moment Nettles took the field with that ominous nickname Puff, a name earned because he would ignite conflict and then vanish before consequences landed squarely on his head, he became a lightning rod for animosity among his peers and opponents. When we examine the specific moments that built his notorious reputation across his entire career, we discover something far more troubling and fundamental than simply being a tough competitor. We find a player who understood how to weaponize the game itself against everyone around him. We find a player who understood the rules in ways that allowed him to exploit them for personal advantage. We find a player willing to hurt people to achieve his goals. This is the detailed anatomy of how Graig Nettles became one of the most vividly disliked and feared figures in Major League Baseball history, despite possessing considerable talent at his position. To understand why so many legends harbored such deep and significant resentment toward this third baseman, we must examine the specific mechanisms of his playstyle and his persona in the clubhouse. Nettles was not merely a participant in the brawls that defined his era. He was often their architect and the person who initiated them. He understood that baseball in the Bronx Zoo was as much a psychological game as a physical one. He grasped that conflict could be weaponized strategically for competitive advantage. He understood that a reputation for danger, once established, could be deployed whenever it became useful to his cause. And most importantly, he comprehended that the consequences of his actions would typically fall on others far more severely than they would fall on himself. That calculation, that cold understanding of cause and effect, is what separated Nettles from other tough players of his generation. Other athletes were physical competitors. Other players had long memories of perceived slights and real insults. But few possessed the strategic mind to weaponize those traits in quite the way Nettles did, with such consistency and deliberation. If you're finding yourself genuinely invested in these deep dives into baseball history and the real conflicts that shaped the sport forever, you absolutely need to use the hype feature on this video right now. It helps us keep creating these detailed stories that bring legends back to life in vivid and compelling ways. And it tells our algorithm that you want more of this high-quality content. Just tap hype before we dive deeper into the chaos and conflict. Let us start with the most recent and most violent incident in this pattern of behavior. Number 6. Donnie Moore. First learned about Nettles' aggressive style the hard way, during one of the wildest moments in baseball history. By August 1984, Nettles had been traded to the San Diego Padres, but his well-earned reputation for instigating conflict had arrived before he did. The Padres organization wanted his veteran presence at third base and his legendary defensive ability. What they actually got was a catalyst for one of the most memorable brawls of the entire modern era. On August 12, 1984, the Padres and Atlanta Braves played a game that would become legendary in baseball lore as the Desert Storm of baseball fights. This was not a simple scuffle or a brief altercation between heated competitors. This was 17 to 19 total ejections and 5 fan arrests, all because tensions had escalated far beyond anything the sport normally tolerates or permits. Braves pitcher Pascual Perez had hit Padres leadoff hitter Alan Wiggins early in the game, establishing the tone of intense hostility that would define the entire afternoon. The Padres spent the entire afternoon plotting retaliation for that initial hit, escalating the violence with each successive pitch thrown. It was baseball's version of an ongoing war between two teams that genuinely hated each other. By the 9th inning, the tension was so thick and palpable you could cut it with a bat. Every single pitch threw more fuel on the fire. Every batter dug in deeper with clear and deliberate intent. Then, Braves reliever Donnie Moore threw a pitch directly at Graig Nettles with unmistakable intention and purpose. This was not just a tactical retaliation for the earlier hit that Perez had thrown at Wiggins. This was a personal strike against a player known for being tough and sometimes abrasive, a player whose fearsome reputation preceded him to San Diego. Moore was making a statement to the entire baseball world. He was saying that Nettles' style of play, his willingness to escalate situations beyond all reason, his presence as a catalyst for pure chaos, would not be tolerated without direct consequence. Nettles immediately charged the mound in response, his eyes burning with rage and indignation. He was wrestling with Braves players Rick Mahler and Chris Chambliss, still struggling desperately to get at more, even as multiple players held him back from making violent contact. Goose Gossage, Nettles' fellow enforcer from their Yankees years, who had come over to San Diego with him, also charged the mound, further escalating the situation into complete and utter anarchy. The chaos spiraled completely out of control in ways that shocked even veteran baseball observers. Injured players literally put on uniforms and came out of the disabled list to participate in the massive brawl. Players who were supposed to be resting because of injuries wanted desperately to get involved. Manager Joe Torre tried to regain control, but could not overcome the momentum of violence. He was frustrated that Moore had allowed the conflict to continue escalating beyond reason, but Moore's actions revealed a deep-seated dislike for Nettles that superseded any managerial instruction. Kurt Bavacqua would later call it the desert storm of baseball fights, and everyone understood that it had all started because of one man's presence on the field. For Donnie Moore and the Braves organization, Nettles was the primary catalyst for what they saw as complete chaos and bedlam. Now we jump back in time to 1974 to understand how this troubling pattern of behavior started. Number 5. Sparky Anderson experienced Nettles' willingness to bend and break the rules of honor back at Shea Stadium. The incident became known throughout baseball as the Super Bowl scandal, and it revealed something fundamental and deeply troubling about Nettles' approach to competition and his hunger to win. During a doubleheader between the Yankees and Detroit Tigers, Nettles hit a home run in the first game. In the second game of the doubleheader, his bat shattered upon contact with a pitch, and 6 rubber Super Balls tumbled out of the hollowed-out barrel. The bat was doctored and illegally modified. It had been deliberately altered to provide an unfair and improper competitive advantage to the batter. Tigers catcher Bill Freehand immediately brought the illegal bat and the loose Super Balls to the umpires, demanding a complete explanation for this clear and obvious violation of the rules. Nettles claimed he got the bat from a fan in the stands and had no knowledge that it was doctored or illegal. He presented himself as an innocent victim of circumstance, as someone who simply accepted equipment from a well-meaning spectator without examining it carefully. Sparky Anderson, the Tigers manager and leader of the organization, viewed this explanation with profound skepticism and considerable disdain. To Anderson, baseball was more than just a game to be won at any cost or by any means necessary. It was a war, but a war that should be fought with traditional honor and integrity. The unwritten codes that governed the sport were sacred to him. They were the very foundation of what made baseball a gentleman's game played by tough and honorable men. What Nettles had done, in Anderson's considered view, was a personal affront to everything the sport stood for and represented. The Tigers management suspected that Nettles had used that same doctored bat to hit the home run earlier that same day, meaning the violation was even more brazen and calculated than it initially appeared. Whether this suspicion was accurate or not, the message Nettles sent to the entire baseball world was absolutely clear and unambiguous. He was willing to use equipment manipulation as easily as he would use his fists. He would find creative and innovative ways to gain competitive advantage. He would push boundaries that other players would not even consider pushing. He would break the rules and then offer questionable and unconvincing explanations. Sparky Anderson never forgot that moment. It stayed with him for the rest of his life. It became foundational to his resentment of Nettles as a player who operated completely outside the conventional ethics that governed professional baseball. Number 4. Bill Lee discovered just how far Nettles would go to inflict deliberate damage to a career on May 20th, 1976 at Yankee Stadium. Bill Lee, the Boston Red Sox pitcher known for his eccentricities and his pointed verbal barbs directed at the Yankees organization, had mocked the Yankees in previous years with language that Nettles had carefully and deliberately cataloged in his memory and held against him like a grudge, waiting for the perfect moment of revenge. When a brawl erupted at home plate following a collision between Lou Piniella and Carlton Fisk, Lee rushed in to defend his teammates and protect them from injury. Nettles, showing the long memory that defined his vindictive persona, specifically targeted him. Nettles did not attack the nearest player in the melee. He searched for Lee with purpose and intent. He wanted Lee specifically for retribution. Outside the main scrum at home plate, Nettles tackled Lee with vicious intent, born from the accumulated resentment he held. He body-slammed him with such tremendous force that Lee landed directly on his pitching shoulder, the most vulnerable and critical part of a pitcher's body, where the shoulder separates and tears easily under such trauma. The injury was immediate and absolutely devastating to his career. Lee suffered a torn shoulder ligament that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his entire career and his effectiveness as a pitcher. The damage was profound and lasting, changing the arc of his professional life forever. Mickey Rivers added further insult to this serious injury by punching Lee as he lay incapacitated on the turf, unable to defend himself or move away from further punishment. What happened next made the situation even worse in Lee's mind and in the Red Sox organization. After the incident was over, Nettles mocked Lee directly, referencing his earlier purse insults, saying he wanted to make sure Lee was not hit with any purse. The joke was cruel and deliberately calculated. The lack of remorse shocked the Red Sox organization and every pitcher who heard about what had occurred. This was not an accident or a tragic consequence of a chaotic brawl that spiraled out of control. This was a deliberate targeting of a specific player, followed by mockery of his serious injury. Lee, who had been a 3-time 17-game winner before the incident and one of the best pitchers in all of baseball, felt his velocity decline significantly after the shoulder injury. The fastball velocity that made him effective at the major league level disappeared forever, taking with it his dominant years as a premier pitcher. He would later say the Red Sox lost the War of 1976 because of Nettles' calculated aggression and the career-altering injury he deliberately inflicted. The Red Sox might have won the World Series that year if Lee had remained healthy. To Boston, Nettles was a vigilante who used the cover of a brawl to commit professional sabotage against a pitcher who had dared to mock his team. The injury created a power vacuum in the Boston rotation that the Yankees would exploit ruthlessly in their run to the World Series championship. Number 3, George Brett faced the most shocking moment of his entire career on October 9, 1977, in Game 5 of the American League Championship Series at Yankee Stadium. This was postseason baseball at its most intense and high stakes. This was a deciding contest where a World Series berth was on the line for both teams. The stakes could not have been higher for either organization. The friction between the Kansas City Royals and New York Yankees was the defining American League rivalry of the entire late 1970s, largely because the two teams met in the ALCS for 3 consecutive years, creating genuine hatred and animosity between the organizations. George Brett was the fiery heart of the Kansas City Royals, the player who represented their best hope for a championship after so many years of organizational futility. Graig Nettles was the Yankees' defensive anchor at third base, guarding that critical position and the reputation of the organization. George Brett slid hard into third base during the first inning, trying to score an important RBI triple off Yankees starter Ron Guidry. His slide was hard and aggressive, the way playoff baseball demanded from its competitors. As he lunged onto the AstroTurf, he became entangled with Nettles at third base in the normal scrum of a play at the bag. What happened next crossed a clear line that shocked the baseball world and remains controversial decades later. While Brett was still on all fours on the AstroTurf, vulnerable and exposed from his slide, Nettles lifted his left foot and intentionally kicked Brett directly in the face. The toe of his cleat caught Brett's chin and jaw with vicious precision. It was not a defensive maneuver or a reflexive action. It was calculated violence disguised as a baseball play. Brett leaped to his feet, incensed by what he viewed as a dirty act that could have broken his jaw or knocked his teeth out. He punched Nettles in the head in immediate retaliation, defending his own physical safety. The bench cleared into chaos. Players streamed onto the field. Fists flew. Bodies collided. Yet somehow, umpire Marty Springstead allowed both players to remain in the game. No ejections, no immediate justice, no consequences. To the Royals, this was absolutely incomprehensible. How could someone kick another player in the face and stay in the game? Nettles' kick was perceived as a gross violation of the game's boundaries. Even inside the Yankee organization, the response was profound. Thurman Munson, the Yankees captain, shielded Brett from further cheap shots during the pile. Munson explicitly told Brett that he would not let anyone hit him while he was down. Even Nettles' own captain recognized his actions as excessive and dangerous. Number 2, Reggie Jackson faced a different kind of attack in the Yankees clubhouse. Nettles and Jackson represented a fundamental clash of values. Jackson was the flamboyant superstar who thrived on attention. Nettles was the cynical professional who viewed Jackson's me-first attitude as a threat to team cohesion. Nettles wielded his primary weapon against Jackson with precision, his tongue. He earned the nickname Puff by delivering devastating one-liners and then disappearing before Jackson could respond. His most famous critique captured the duality perfectly. The best thing about being a Yankee is getting to watch Reggie Jackson play every day. The worst thing about being a Yankee is getting to watch Reggie Jackson play every day. This statement signaled to the team that Jackson was an outsider, even in his own clubhouse. Nettles also mocked Jackson's strikeout rate by suggesting that if Babe Ruth were alive, he would not be able to bat cleanup for the Yankees because he did not strike out enough. By including himself in the joke, Nettles subtly suggested that Jackson's style was inefficient, and that his prominence came from ego rather than superior performance. But George Brett also faced Nettles' tactical approach to the rules themselves in 1983. Nettles noticed excessive pine tar on Brett's bat earlier in the season. He alerted Billy Martin to the violation. While technically legal, holding that information until the most advantageous moment was pure Machiavellianism. The Royals saw it as angle hunting, as Nettles looking for ways to disadvantage his opponents through tactics rather than pure talent. It was yet another reason why, when George Brett looked across the diamond at third base, he saw not just a rival, but a player whose primary goal was to find the angle that would disadvantage his peers. The broader impact of Nettles' style extended even to his own teammates. Number 1, Goose Gossage occupied a unique space in the Nettles narrative. Gossage was often a teammate and fellow enforcer, part of the culture that Nettles helped build during the Yankees' dynasty years. Yet, even within this alliance, friction and volatility simmered beneath the surface. In April 1979, Gossage became involved in a clubhouse brawl with teammate Cliff Johnson following a loss to the Orioles. Gossage broke his thumb in the fight, sidelined for months, effectively ending the Yankees' chances of defending their World Series title. While Nettles was not a combatant in this specific fight, he was the primary chronicler of the dysfunction. In his book Balls, he detailed the incident in a way that Gossage and others felt was disloyal to the sanctity of the clubhouse and the code of silence that bound teammates together. This willingness to monetize clubhouse secrets made him a pariah to players who believed in the foxhole mentality, where you protect your brothers no matter what happens. For Gossage, for Jackson, for all the legends who dealt with him, Nettles represented something fundamentally untrustworthy and dangerous. He was dangerous not just on the field, but in how he weaponized the game's unofficial codes against anyone who stood in his way. What makes the Nettles situation so complex is the statistical paradox at the heart of his legacy. By almost any modern metric, Graig Nettles belongs in the Hall of Fame. His defensive value is ranked among the top 5 in history for his position. He led the American League in home runs in 1976 when he was in his prime. He was a primary engine for 2 World Series winners in 1977 and 1978 when the Yankees dominated baseball. His defensive WAR places him in elite company with the greatest third baseman ever to play the position. His offensive power exceeded many Hall of Famers who play at his position. On paper, the case for Nettles is compelling and substantial. Yet his career batting average of .248 and his remarkably low BABIP, the lowest in history for a batter with over 7,000 plate appearances, made him a target for traditionalist critics. More importantly, the accumulated weight of his brawls, his feuds, his public criticisms, and his reputation as an instigator created a narrative so powerful that it has overshadowed his statistical contributions entirely. The Hall of Fame Veterans Committee and the Baseball Writers Association have found it difficult to overcome that negative weight. When you stack the kick to Brett against the slam of Lee, the mocking of Jackson, the cheating with the Super Bowl bat, and the betrayal of Gossage through his tell-all autobiography, the statistics seem almost irrelevant to his legacy. Yet here is where the story shifts toward a more nuanced and complex understanding. The era in which Nettles played was defined by genuine grit and intensity. The Bronx Zoo was not a peaceful organization by any measure. It was a chaotic, winning, passionate environment where competition superseded comfort. Nettles provided the friction that fueled the Yankees' success during those years. He was part of what made that era unforgettable and compelling to baseball fans. George Brett would eventually conclude that the hate of the era, the intensity, the willingness to cross normal boundaries, was part of what made the players great and memorable. The conflict shaped them and made them who they were. It made them tougher and more resilient. It made them more focused and determined. It created rivalries that lasted entire careers. Baseball is better when there is genuine animosity, when there is something to prove, when the stakes feel real and personal. The problem with Nettles is that he took that intensity and weaponized it in ways that crossed ethical and physical lines. He did not just compete harder than everyone else. He cheated with bats and equipment. He targeted vulnerable players during brawls to inflict injury. He used psychological warfare to isolate teammates from the team's cohesion. He exploited the game's unwritten rules for personal advantage. His methods were calculated in ways that suggested something darker than simple competitive intensity. What Nettles ultimately remains is a necessary antagonist in baseball history. He was the friction that made the Yankees tick during their era of dominance. He was the reason opposing teams despised the Bronx Zoo and what it represented. He was the player who made people care enough to hate him intensely. In a sport that can sometimes feel too controlled and sanitized, Nettles represented chaos and danger and unpredictability. That has value in baseball. That makes baseball unforgettable. But it came at a cost to his professional standing and his place in history. The legends of the game did not hate Nettles simply because he was a Yankee or simply because he was a tough competitor. They hated him because he was willing to weaponize the social and physical vulnerabilities of the game for his own competitive ends. For those who played against him and with him, the memory of his abilities is forever linked to the memory of his methods. Graig Nettles remains one of the most vividly disliked figures in Major League Baseball history, not because he was simply a tough competitor, but because he understood that winning could come at a human cost and accepted that trade every single time. If you made it this far, you understand why this era of baseball still captivates us decades later. These were real rivalries with real stakes and real consequences. Drop a like on this video if you want more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep exploring the conflicts that defined baseball history. And comment below with the most memorable brawl or feud that you know about from baseball history. We are building a community of people who love this sport enough to dig into its past and understand its complexity. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. This is where baseball history comes alive. The consequences of Nettles' behavior extended far beyond the immediate incidents themselves. When Bill Lee lost his shoulder, it was not just Lee who suffered. The entire Red Sox organization suffered. The team that could have competed for a championship found itself with a weakened rotation. The Yankees, having caused this damage, benefited from it. This was not an accident. This was the direct result of a calculated act of violence. The Red Sox recognized this, and their animosity toward Nettles grew into something deep and abiding. Years later, players who had been on that 1976 Red Sox team would still speak about Nettles with anger and bitterness. They saw him as someone who had sabotaged their championship dreams through physical assault disguised as baseball. The psychological impact of Nettles' actions on other players cannot be underestimated. When George Brett got kicked in the face during the 1977 ALCS, it sent a message to every player in baseball. It said that Nettles was willing to cross any line to win. It said that the consequences would be light or non-existent. It said that if you played against the Yankees, you needed to be prepared for anything. This knowledge hung over every at-bat, every play at third base. Players had to think about whether Graig Nettles might kick them, attack them, or deliberately injure them. This psychological warfare was as effective as any physical prowess. It got into opponents' heads. It made them uncomfortable and afraid. This is precisely what Nettles wanted. The Bronx Zoo era was characterized by dysfunction, but Nettles took it to a new level. While other Yankees played hard and competed intensely, Nettles also weaponized the clubhouse environment. The fact that he would later publish tell-all stories about his teammates showed that he viewed the team as a means to an end, not as a brotherhood. Reggie Jackson, despite all his flaws and his ego, at least believed in the Yankees organization. Nettles seemed to view it as something to be exploited and then written about. This fundamental difference in approach to the game created a rift that never quite healed, even as the Yankees won championships. The broader context of why baseball legends hated Nettles becomes clearer when we understand that his behavior represented something antithetical to the unwritten code of the sport. Baseball has always had unwritten rules. You do not throw at a batter's head. You do not deliberately injure opponents. You do not betray your teammates. You do not exploit the rules in ways that violate the spirit of the game. Nettles violated all of these rules repeatedly. This is why his legacy is tainted, despite his statistical accomplishments. This is why the Hall of Fame electors have struggled with his candidacy. They know his numbers are Hall of Fame caliber, but they also know what kind of person he was. That internal conflict has kept him out of Cooperstown for decades. The statistical achievements and the behavioral reality exist in a strange tension. On one hand, Nettles was an elite third baseman whose contributions to winning were real and substantial. On the other hand, he was a player whose methods were questionable and whose character was suspect. The Hall of Fame has always grappled with this kind of player. Should we honor pure talent, or should character matter? Should winning be all that matters, or should how you win also be considered? These are the questions that Graig Nettles forces us to confront. Understanding the full scope of Nettles' impact requires understanding the Yankees organization of that era. The Bronx Zoo was managed by Billy Martin, a man himself known for aggressive behavior and conflict. The team owner was George Steinbrenner, known for his imperious style and his willingness to do whatever it took to win. In this environment, Nettles found fertile ground for his methods. He was encouraged to be aggressive. He was rewarded for his defense and his willingness to push boundaries. The organization created a culture where winning was more important than everything else. In such a culture, someone like Nettles could thrive. He understood the assignment. He understood what was expected. He delivered it, and he did it without apology or remorse. The rivalry between the Yankees and Royals in the late 1970s was one of the greatest rivalries in baseball history. These teams played each other repeatedly, and the games meant something. The World Series was on the line. The careers of great players were on the line, and Graig Nettles became the face of Yankees' aggression and dirty play. George Brett became the face of Royals' excellence and dignity. The contrast between the two could not have been starker. Brett played hard, played to win, but played within the rules. Nettles played hard, played to win, and did whatever he felt was necessary, regardless of rules or ethics. This contrast defined the rivalry. When we examine the timeline of incidents, we see a progression and escalation. The Super Bowl incident in 1974 showed Nettles was willing to cheat with equipment. The Lee incident in 1976 showed he was willing to deliberately injure opponents during brawls. The Brett kick in 1977 showed he was willing to directly assault players in full view. By the time he got to San Diego in 1984, his presence alone was enough to spark massive brawls. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern of escalation. Each incident emboldened him to take the next step. Each time he avoided serious consequences, he felt justified in his methods. The question of whether Nettles' behavior actually helped the Yankees win is an interesting one. Did his aggressive style contribute to their championships? Possibly. The Yankees won championships in 1977 and 1978. They could have won those same championships with a player who was slightly less aggressive but more ethical. There is no way to know for sure. What we do know is that Nettles' legacy is complex because his achievements are inseparable from his methods. Looking at Nettles from the perspective of modern baseball is also revealing. In contemporary baseball, many of the things Nettles did would result in immediate ejection and suspension. The kick to Brett would draw a 5-game suspension minimum. The slam of Lee would result in similar punishment. The doctored bat would be confiscated immediately. The game has evolved to protect players more than it did in the 1970s. This makes Nettles a product of his era in some ways. But even in the 1970s, many players and managers saw his behavior as beyond the pale. Sparky Anderson was deeply offended. Thurman Munson felt the need to protect Brett from his own teammate. These reactions suggest that even by the standards of the time, Nettles went too far. The legacy of Graig Nettles is ultimately one of missed opportunity. Had he channeled his competitive fire into his craft without the deliberate violence and psychological manipulation, he might be in the Hall of Fame. His numbers support his case. His defensive excellence is legendary. His power was real. But the choices he made, the lines he crossed, the people he hurt, have defined his legacy more than his statistics. This is a cautionary tale about how the way you play the game matters. It is a reminder that winning is not the only thing that matters. How you win matters. Who you hurt matters. The methods you use matter. Graig Nettles failed to understand this, or he understood it and did not care. Either way, it cost him dearly in his place in baseball history. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Nettles case is how it reveals the complexity of sports history and legacy. Athletes are not one-dimensional. They are complex human beings who can be simultaneously talented and flawed, excellent and dangerous, legendary and despicable. Graig Nettles was all of these things at once. He was one of the best third basemen to ever play the game. He was also a player willing to deliberately injure others to win. Both things are true. Both things define him. When George Brett finally achieved his chance to play in the World Series in 1985, he did it without Nettles standing at third base opposite him. Nettles was gone by then, his career winding down in San Diego. But the kick from 8 years earlier was not forgotten. Brett would never forget it. The entire baseball community knew about it. It had become the defining moment of Nettles' career in the minds of many. This is what happened to Graig Nettles. The interview clips of Nettles from his later years show a man who seems to lack remorse for his actions. He does not apologize for the kick to Brett. He does not express regret about the injury to Lee. He seems to view his actions as simply part of playing hard and winning games. This attitude, this refusal to acknowledge the harm he caused, is perhaps what makes the legend's hatred of him most justified. Brett is in the Hall of Fame because he was an excellent player who also played with integrity. The fact that even Brett, even this paragon of excellence, harbored hatred for Nettles speaks volumes about how far Nettles crossed the line. It is one thing for opponents to dislike you because you beat them. It is another for them to hate you because of how you treated them. Moving forward, the question becomes whether future generations of baseball fans will understand the full context of Nettles' legacy. Will they see only the statistics and assume he was a great player unfairly kept out of the Hall of Fame? Will they understand the human cost of his methods? Will they know about Bill Lee's career being cut short by an injury Nettles deliberately inflicted? Will they know about the kick to George Brett's face? Will they understand that even Thurman Munson felt the need to protect an opponent from Nettles' excess? These are the details that matter for a complete understanding of who Nettles was as a player and as a person. The Bronx Zoo era is remembered with a mixture of nostalgia and incredulity. Baseball fans from that time remember it as an exciting, chaotic, winning period. But they also remember it as something that could not happen today. The sport has evolved, and so have our expectations of players. We expect more from our heroes than we used to. We expect them to play hard, but fair. We expect them to respect the game and the players they compete against. Graig Nettles represented an older era of baseball, where the rules were looser and the consequences for crossing the line were minimal. That era is over. Nettles is a relic of a different baseball. Continue to remember, continue to discuss, tell the story.